Well, good morning, church. It's good to be with all of you today. But I have to say, it's a little bit strange. Every time I come, I've got a couple of less friends here. You know, I still walk in expecting to see Rod or Greg, and now Pastor Jim is missing. So it sure feels different without Pastor Jim. You know, every time I come, I always think of his office there in the years that we had together, and I miss him, and I know that you must miss him an awful lot more than that. So, but we are happy to be here. I'm going to invite Kim and our family and our friend Will to come up here. We're going to start with a couple of quick testimonies. And apparently I can control the PowerPoint with this thing. All right. Oh, yeah, it works. All right. I just want to... We're going to share a couple of testimonies of one of the things that we did this past summer, and then I'm going to give a bit of a missions report. But you remember my wife Kim, this is our youngest son Jude, our middle son Malachi, and this is our friend Will. And so one of the things that we do as missionaries here in Canada is we do a national evangelism tour where we travel across Canada. Last summer, we traveled, our truck says we did just shy of 17,000 kilometers. For those of you who count numbers, that also means we spent almost $10,000 in gas because we did it towing RVs and living in RVs as we traveled across Canada. And one of our goals for traveling across Canada is to advance God's kingdom, to share a gospel, and to do it in new and creative ways. And so as we traveled across Canada, we spent a significant amount of time praying for the nation, worshiping the Lord, asking Him for advice on how to do certain things. And then we would do teaching in churches on evangelism. We would go out onto the streets and do evangelism. We would go to parks and do evangelism. And the bottom picture here, Malachi is going to share a quick testimony about what we were doing there. This was in Wolfville, Nova Scotia.
So in case you can't read that sign, that her name is Elizabeth, that lady that's holding up, it was called Jesus Burgers. And the idea is that we just put on a meal and invite anyone and everyone to it. So we went out that morning and just went out on the streets. And there's that one story in the Bible about the wedding feast where the guests didn't show up, so we went out to the highways and the byways and invited everyone and anyone who would come. And we just said, hey, we're giving you burgers. It's free food. Why not show up? Then we went and set up in this park. Originally, we were going to do it in we went to Wolfville. There was this other place, I think it was called Centerville, but there's a big motorcycle rally going on there called the Devil's Half Acre, so we couldn't go there. So instead, we went to Wolfville and said, well, you can either go to the Devil's Half Acre or to Jesus Burgers. And a lot of people showed up, way more. I was like, well, that's going on. You know, we're trying to get all these street people coming. And we had like 60, 70, 80, 90 people show up. And we just had worship music and gave them food and talked. And I'm not sure why, but whenever I go out and share gospel, in my mind, people are like super defensive. And like if I mention Jesus, I'm going to get slapped or something. But that didn't happen. And I sat down with my burger and just talked about God and talked about Jesus and talked about how life isn't what we always want it to be. And it was really eye-opening. And it was just like, this maybe is what evangelism looks like. It isn't that the second I mention Jesus, they're going to slap me. We just sit down with them and talk about Jesus. And so it was really great. Had a bunch of great conversations and just talked about Jesus for hours on end over a good burger, too.
These three guys are actually going to teach the Sunday school class downstairs some of the simple tools that we use when we travel across Canada to share gospel. So these guys are going to lead the Sunday school class and maybe even do a demonstration down there. So our team fluctuated. We have lots of volunteers that came and join us for part of the trip. One of our other highlights was actually not too far from here. You guys know where Ear Falls, Ontario is? Just not too far from Kenora, Ontario. They have a music festival called the Trout Forest Music Festival. And we've had it on our heart for a number of years to do ministry in folk festivals. Because one thing that we notice is that when we go out on the streets, like streets of Victoria or Edmonton or wherever we are, and share gospel, most people are busy. They're usually going from work to a meeting to lunch to pick up kids to get the car in the parking lot. But when you go to a folk music festival, do you know what people go there to do? They go there to sit and talk. They go there to talk about the meaning of life, purpose, maybe politics, but they'll stay up really late around the fire just talking about faith issues. And we said, well, shouldn't that be where Christians go? And so we spent 4 days volunteering at the Folk Music Festival in Ear Falls, Ontario. And I'll tell you, we had some of the best conversations ever at that music festival. And we're actually hoping to encourage more Christians to go and volunteer at folk music festivals. It's wide open doors to share the gospel. And this last picture, this is us standing in the Atlantic Ocean. It's kind of like a triumph. You know, it's actually really challenging to drive across Canada with RVs, with a team of people. This is the core group that traveled across Canada, and this is kind of like our victory moment standing in the Atlantic Ocean. One of the families in the middle there came all the way from Switzerland to come travel across Canada with us and share gospel. So, yeah, if you ever want to join us, we seem to be in a pattern of doing the big national tour every 2 years. And if you have an RV and a truck and 4 months, we would love to have you, or even 2 weeks. Okay, and before we go much further, we had a really special surprise last night.
Yes, I would love to share about it. So we had dinner in Oakbank last night and met the Amazing Grace that many of you know. Oh, Amazing Grace, I love that. That was a Jesus moment. And Grace and I were just chatting, and we were asking her, you know, where she's from, and she's from a city that we've been in several times, and we said, oh, what area have you been in? And we've been in the same area, and then we talked about, you know, how connections we had, and all of a sudden, we're like, we think we've met before. Like, we sent outreach teams from Youth with a Mission in Alberta to Grace's little town where she was and ran youth groups there with a place called House of Jubilee. And we were looking at the pictures, and I was like, I remember doing youth group around this a pool table at night with all the geckos up on the light and sharing about Jesus. And Grace is like, I was there. I was there. And that's her community. And we just were so delighted at what God has done in Grace's life and how he has encountered her family. And she told us about how her sister's serving the Lord and her dad's a pastor. And she's here in Oakbank, Manitoba, all the way from the Philippines. I know, only Jesus, hey? And it was this, we called it a full circle moment where that obedience from, it wasn't even necessarily our obedience, our base was sending teams there, and we happened to go on one of the last teams, but that they encountered Grace's family and were able to support a ministry there that allowed people to hear about Jesus, and eventually we would end up here together. So fun. Thank you, Jesus.
I just want to share one more connection with Grace. So, we run discipleship training schools. We mentor young people into missions. And one of the very first discipleship schools that we ran in Alberta had a young man from Ontario named Jeff Smith. And Jeff Smith was had kind of a rough start in life. He was in some gangs, and he came to Christ, came to be discipled. And we were going to send him to the Philippines to do some mission work. And when we went to go get his visa, we had to get a criminal record check, and when we went into the RCMP station, turns out he has a criminal record. And when we went to the office for immigration, they said you can get a pardon, but it takes 2 to 4 months, and we needed it in like 3 days. So Jeff said he felt called to the Philippines. We went to the parking lot, sat down in the car, and we prayed, and we felt like the Lord said, well, submit the application. So we went into the office to submit it, and they said, you're crazy, it takes at least 2 months. And they said, we can make one phone call, and they called the office in Ontario to see if there's anything they can do. Guess what happened? Guess who the one person in Ontario was? It was Jeff's auntie. And Jeff's auntie heard this and said, I'll have it for you in 24 hours. And so Jeff went to the Philippines on outreach as a 19-year-old, came back, and he said to me, Adam, God has called me to be a missionary to the Philippines. He did some support raising, went back in 1 year. He's still there today. He started an amazing ministry called Well of Life, and Grace was one of the board members and staff at Well of Life in the Philippines. And then a number of years ago, Teen Challenge reached out and asked if they could start a teen challenge for women in the Philippines. And so Jeff and his wife Lydia have also pioneered Teen Challenge in the Philippines. And it all comes from one young man from Ontario that you supported us to disciple and mentor. So it's just incredible. The odds were like 1 in 8 billion that we'd bump into her here. But we were just so encouraged. Anyway, thanks so much, you guys. Have a seat.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. Earlier, while I was sitting there, I wrote something, and it's something really I am grateful with. And it's so amazing what they've said earlier is legit. It's true. It's true. So allow me to read this so it would be easier for me. Okay, as you know, my story of how I got saved is through Vacation Bible School when I was a kid. So I just wanted to praise God because last night the Lord reminded me once again of His love. And the first time I encountered Him through the ministry for kids, specifically through VBS or Vacation Bible School for Kids. And because I had a reunion with this family. And who sent teams to the Philippines and collaborated with the church I attended. So I personally thank God for making them instruments to bring me to the Lord. And I also thank the Oakbank Baptist Church because how He told me that this church is one of their supporters. So thank you. And so thank you for supporting them in pursuing their mission for God. If I had not been part of that Vacation Bible School for Kids, I don't think I would have come to know the Lord. So, so praise God. Jesus, His name is above every other name. Jesus is the one who could save us, who could save a life. So praise the Lord, and thank you guys. Thank you, Oakbank congregation and leaders. Praise the Lord.
So good. Okay, we better get going. Pastor Adam says I only have 1 hour. Starting now. So the last time I was here, I was actually presenting some of the research from my master's degree about evangelism in Canada and the state of the church and numbers. And I think when I was done, Howie called it the most depressing sermon he's ever heard. Actually, no, it was actually my wife, Kim. It's a true story. To be honest, what often happens is when I come here, I get really excited to talk to you guys, and I usually write a new message and pray for a new sermon, and then I go home and go, oh, I can make that better. Then I practice it 2 or 3 more times and use it for a few months. So you guys are always my guinea pigs. So after that last one, Kim said that was the most depressing thing I've ever heard. So I added on to it and talked about some hope and stuff. So it did get better. But I am hoping that this message will be encouraging. I want to give you a brief history of world missions and then talk to you a little bit about what direction missions is going in right now. Because I'm a big picture guy. I really like to know what's happening at a global level. And I really like to see how history kind of goes like this in a certain direction. So I want to give to you in the next 15 minutes 2,000 years of missions history. So we begin, of course, with the Great Commission. Jesus walked on the earth with his public ministry for a number of years. He had his close group of disciples, he had his followers, and then at the end of his time on earth, Jesus gave them a commission. He says, I want you to go to the entire world, and I want you to continue what I started. I want you to tell them about the kingdom of God. I want you to spread the gospel. I want you to teach them to obey everything that I've commanded you to do. That's what I'm challenging you, commissioning you to do. And so out of that, the church was formed. Mission started first, and the church was an extension of that missions call. So your commission, your job as church, as Oak Bank Baptist Church, is to go into all the world preaching the gospel. Soon as Jesus was taken up into heaven, his disciples immediately began to do what he had asked them to do. And they went out into what was then the Roman world, which was basically the known world at the time. And they established churches in some of the major cities. Then we come into Atkinson period, and this is basically when the last person who saw Jesus in the flesh died. And when that person died, we'd enter into this Atkinson period, right before the Nicene Creed. And this was an explosive time of church growth. We've got a graphic here. This is the Roman Empire. For many people, this was the known world. So when Jesus said, take the gospel to the ends of the earth, for most people, this was the ends of the earth. And we see here that in the first 300 years of Christianity, that they grew to the ends of the earth. So you can tell that's Israel down there, kind of on the bottom right. And you can see the number of churches that were there, first century. Second century, we see that it is expanding. Third century, we see that they have completely covered the Roman world. Massive time of growth. One of the things that happened during this time is that they became very involved in politics, and they became the state religion of the Roman Empire, which helped them tremendously in their growth. But at the same time, it also hindered some of the ministry and some of the things that they did. That's probably a discussion for another time. You may look at this map and go, hey, wait a minute. I think that the gospel went to other places, and that's true. There were a bunch of very interesting missionaries or disciples that went much further than everybody else. This is St. Thomas, Doubting Thomas. Does anybody know where he went? This is kind of a famous story. How far did this guy travel? India. Yep. Yep. He took the gospel to India, established churches there, and when I've traveled to India, there are still many millions of believers who trace their lineage all the way back to Thomas the Apostle that traveled all the way to India. So I'm going quick here, but I do want you to know that there were different people that felt called by God to go the extra mile and to go much further than anybody else. So when I say that the church was in this area, I want you to know that church did have a few people that went to some outlying regions. Post-Nicene period is quite a large period of church time. So if you look up there, that's from the year 325 till about 1792. You know, even as I put these numbers up here and put some of the points, I'm going fast, so there are some generalizations. But for the most part, this is agreed to be the largest time in church history, especially in terms of evangelism and the Great Commission. Lots of things happened during this time. During this time, as I already hinted at, the church became very political. And they got the Catholic Church, the Pope would be deciding who would be king. Kings would decide who is pope. Sometimes a pope would want to be king. There was all sorts of this intermarriage between religion and government, and it got very unhealthy. And so there was, because of that, there were some significant splits. Early on, there was the Eastern Orthodox Church that broke off, and then, of course, we have the Anabaptist movement and the Protestant movement, and a few other things that happened during that time. As a result, as they were trying to correct how Christians interact with government and the rest of the world. So that period, that was a long period of time. That was over 1,000 years. And during that time, Christianity, are you excited to see how much it grew in that time? Well, here we are. So this was the Roman world in 325. And this is how much they grew in just over 1,000 years. Actually, the exact number, oops, oh, my thing disappeared. That it was 1,400 and some years. And can you see the church growth in 1,400 years? It's a little bit tricky. You almost have to squint your eyes to see it. But it grew north into modern-day Germany and Poland and most of Great Britain. But that was 1,400 and some years of growth. So in that first 3 centuries, we had quite explosive growth that took over the whole known world at the time. And then in 1,400 years, even though the known world was much bigger, they knew about all of Asia, and they knew about Africa. They had discovered North America by the end of this period. Christianity really only had this small amount of growth. And then that brings us to the modern missions movement. And we're going to spend more time here talking about what happened after the year 1792. And it's when you talk about modern world missions, it's really generally agreed that there was 3 movements or 3 waves of modern missions. 3 waves of modern missions. So we're going to talk about them briefly. They were the coastal missions, inland missions, and then the people group movement. And then we're going to have a bit of a surprise, and a little bit later we're going to talk about the 4th wave of missions that is emerging. Let's go through some history. So these are some names, maybe some pictures that you may recognize. These are the leaders of the different mission waves. Now, you know, I had to pick just one person for each of them, but like so many things in Christianity, there were a lot more people involved in each of these mission waves. William Carey wasn't the only person to do coastal missions. Hudson Taylor wasn't the only person to do inland missions, but they're probably the most famous people. So we're going to talk about them a little bit to explain what the differences are. So William Carey, born in 1761, and he wrote an essay called An Inquiry into the Obligations of Christians to Use Means for the Conversion of the Heathens. Most of you probably have that on your bookshelf somewhere. Hopefully you've read it. But it was a really influential essay at the time where he was looking at the world map, kind of like I showed you a few minutes ago, where Christianity was really just in Europe. And he was looking at the gospel accounts, and he noticed that Jesus said, go into all the world, but Christianity had only gone into mostly Europe and a little bit in North Africa. And he understood that this was wrong and that we had to go into the entire world. And so he wrote this paper, and he helped he helped form a couple of different missions organizations, and he says, let's go to the ends of the earth. And what they did is they began to ride on boats that were already traveling around the world on trading missions. So they didn't have their own boats or their own equipment, but they would go catch a ride and go to all the places that you see on the map. And that's why it's called coastal missions, because they were only using boats. And they established churches and mission bases, Bible schools, hospitals, all around the world in all the major ports in all the major cities. And this was a brand new idea at the time, because for 1,400 and some years, Christianity only was known in Europe. And now they understood that it had to go into the whole world, so they rowed on boats to all these places. Now, again, it's a bit of a generalization, because on the trading ships that had been going for hundreds of years before that, they would often have chaplains on the boat, but they weren't missionaries. They were there for spiritual care for the captain and the crew, but they very rarely would do missions work when they landed somewhere. So Christians may have traveled around the world, but they weren't there to establish churches and Bible schools and mission centers. And so with coastal missions, they got off the boat and stayed there. One of the things that happened in the South Pacific, you remember that our family served in Fiji in the South Pacific for many years, is that the London Missionary Society sent several missionaries to what's now known as the Cook Islands, and they established a Bible school there. and they trained up dozens and dozens of men to become missionaries. And then they commissioned boats, and they went around to all the Pacific region and just dropped them off on every island they could find. And so boats were really important in those early mission days for the coastal missions. Well, you can guess what came next. Hudson Taylor noticed when you looked at the map that we were only getting to the fringe, that we were only getting to the port cities. And Hudson Taylor said, we need to go into the countries. We have to go to the secondary cities. We have to go to the secondary capitals. We have to go to the different provinces in each of the places. And so he started to teach people to go off the ship, get onto trains or horses or walk, and to go inland. That's why we have this term, inland missions. Another interesting thing that happened here is that they needed more missionaries to do this. And there was the Baptist Mission Society, the London Missionary Society. There were a few missions organizations, but they would only fund a small handful of missionaries each year. So we've got the entire world to evangelize, but these missionary societies would only have enough money to fully fund a couple of hundred missionaries for the entire world. And so Hudson Taylor began to advocate that people go by faith and trust the Lord to supply all their needs. And so this was a brand new idea, that a person could live by faith and be a missionary and travel somewhere really far overseas. And so he also is credited with starting what we call faith missions. And of course, YWAM is one of those faith missions. The other thing that shifted during this time is that missions was, up until this point, really based, obviously Christianity was in Europe, and almost all the missionaries came from Europe. And then in the late 1800s, that Christianity in America grew so much that they began to send a majority of missionaries out around the world. That's why it says American dominance. It shifted that more missionaries came from America than anywhere else. And that's still true today. If you look at the number of missionaries around the world, America still has a very strong majority of missionaries around the world. Another thing that inland missions did differently is they would begin to adopt the local dress of the people that they were ministering to. They thought that it would break down barriers to dress and act more like the people that they were speaking to. They began to translate the Bible into multiple languages during the inland missions movement. Here are some, I think they must be Baptist from the expression on their face. All right. Then a very significant event happened during the World Missionary Conference in Edinburgh in 1910. This was a gathering of some of the largest missionary societies, scholars, Bible teachers, kind of like if you were anybody in the missions world, you went to this conference in 1910, and they had a series of people getting up and sharing essays and research and looking at maps and numbers and statistics. And they were asking the question, what else do we have to do to reach the lost? And one of the things that they noticed is that there weren't that many countries in the world. And that that almost every single country in the world had missionaries. But what does it take to be obedient to go to all the nations of the world? And so they had this pioneering idea that there are people groups in the world. So they said, okay, there may only be 180 countries in the world, but many of those countries will have very specific people groups inside them that are unique. They have a unique language, culture, dress, and each of those people groups needs to have an expression of church, of evangelism. And so they said, okay, there's 180 some countries at the time. How many people groups are there? So they set up a commission, and they began to count how many individual people groups are in the world. And again, this is a big number, and it kind of depends how you count. But does anybody have an idea roughly about how many people groups exist in the world right now? Again, it depends. 18,000 to 26,000 people groups around the world. Individual language, culture, dress. And so in 1910, they said it's not enough for us to go to every country of the world. We have to go to every single people group of the world. So that means 180 countries. That's a pretty easy task. But if there's 26,000 people groups around the world, then we need to go to 26,000 different places and possibly have 26,000 languages of the Bible translated. So it suddenly was a much bigger task, but it meant that they were very thorough in their obedience to the Lord. And I don't know if you remember the last time I was here, I was sharing that a number of years ago, the 5 biggest missions organizations in the world got together and collated their data and said if there's 26,000 people groups in the world, we've been going to many of them, how many are left? And there's this incredible number that we've discovered. Do you remember how many people groups are left in the world without a witness? Well, 8 years ago, when we were at this conference and they handed us the report, there was 633. Only 633 people groups in the entire world that do not have missionaries actively sharing the gospel to that people group. That's incredible news. That's incredible news. Another thing that happened during this movement is that over the next few years, they said, you know what? Christianity is not just for white Europeans. This is God's people around the world. And so we have what's called the indigenization of Christianity, which means that you can worship God in your culture. You can write songs. You can wear different clothing. You don't have to dress like a white European. That you can have different musical instruments up on the stage. You don't even need to have a stage. You don't even need to have pews. They said that you can worship God how you like in your culture. I already talked about identifying people groups. The other thing that's really important to note is that it was already a number of years ago that we realized, hey, it's not just the job of white Protestant missionaries to share the gospel around the world. And so we've had non-Western missionaries for several generations now. I want to share with you an interesting graphic about that. This is Christians around the world, global Christianity. And you can see that it wasn't that long ago, in 1900, that almost 70% of all Christians were in Europe. If you look at that chart on the far left, you see that the vast majority of Christians lived in Europe. And you see that as the years changed, that more and more people came to faith, especially in Africa. Latin America grew early, and then some in Asia. And that now it's a minority, a pretty small minority number of Christians that live in Europe and Africa. Africa is now and projected to be even more the home of the majority of world Christians. All right, Donald McGravin, if you want to read more about him, he was one of the more famous teachers during this period. He was the founding dean at the School of World Mission at Fuller Theological Seminary. He wrote a lot of essays, helped author books about people movements and what it looks like for a people group to come to Christ, not just one or two people. And so he's kind of like the face of this missions movement. All right. Well, I promised you that we would go quickly, so we talked about coastal missions, inland missions, people groups, and what I'm really excited to do is to talk about the fourth wave. What is happening now? We see that Christianity had explosive growth in the first 3 centuries, And then for 1,400 years, it had almost no growth. And then we had the modern missions movement, coastal missions, inland missions, people groups that took the gospel. So it was 8 years ago that we only had 633 people groups left to go. So hopefully you're thinking, well, where else do we have to go? If we're 99% of the way through the people groups, where else do we have to go? Well, the fourth wave identifies the last place where gospel has to go. But we're going to do that in Sunday school. So, I encourage you to come downstairs in a few minutes, and we are going to spend our Sunday school hour talking about the fourth wave, which I think for us is actually the most exciting wave. And most likely it's going to be the last wave of world missions before end times. The other thing that I'll encourage you to come downstairs, Kim and I made a little report that we're going to put on the table downstairs, a bit of a missions report to help you know some of the things that we do. You've heard us talk about about doing evangelism tours across Canada, but we're also very involved in many other ministries and have some goals for the nation of Canada. So if you come downstairs, we're going to have these on the table for you to learn about. Anyway, thank you for listening. Hopefully this is encouraging and you've learned something new, but I'm so excited to share with you the future of missions downstairs.